Good morning. I've got to turn my mic on. We're continuing in a series. This is our third message in this same series on the 6 logical reasons to believe in God. Now, there are other reasons to believe in God besides logical reasons, but these are logical reasons to believe in God. But before I begin, I'd just like to ask God to bless our time. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be pleasing to you, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. Amen. Just wanted to also point out that I typically use passages from 3 different translations. People ask, what translation do you use? And I tend to use mostly the New Living Translation. I like it because it's very easy to read in public. It's simple language, and it's also a very good translation. But many of you will be more familiar with either the New International Version, NIV, which I also use from time to time, and the King James, although I actually like the New King James versus the Old King James because it's just easier to understand. So those are the 3 that I typically use. I may toss another one in there now and then, but we all are also are supposed to include the copyright notifications, and there they are. The Bible says that we should always be prepared to give an answer to anyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect. The word reason in this passage is the Greek word logos. The New Testament was written originally in Greek. And it's interesting that that word logos literally means word or thought, but we get the word logic from that word logos. And so it has this additional meaning to it, which is a logical argument, a reason. And the purpose of a logical argument is to convince someone that something is true by providing sound reasons for that belief. Now, we use the word argument in there, and sometimes argument gets heated. We're not talking about heated arguments. We're talking about logical arguments. And the Bible is very clear that when we discuss reasons for believing in God, that we should do so with gentleness and respect. And so that's what my goal is to give you some tools to use if you do have a chance to discuss this with friends and family, that you can do so both logically but also with gentleness and respect. And because these are logical arguments, they follow a certain pattern. Starts off with 1 or 2 what are considered to be truthful statements. And that those truthful statements then lead to a logical conclusion. So, for example, if A is true and B is true, then C is true. We listed 6 of them to begin with. The first is the origin of the universe. This is called the cosmological argument. It's a very ancient argument for the existence of God. It essentially means that the universe began to exist. There's a beginning to the universe. And we also know that it's reasonable to assume that anything that has a beginning has a cause. Therefore, we can assume that the universe had a beginning, that it therefore had a cause, and that cause is outside the universe, something greater than the universe, and we call the cause God. Secondly is the design of the universe. This is called the teleological argument. Teleos means end or purpose, goal. Same kind of an idea that the beginning of the universe, at the very start of it, that there's a whole series of things that happen, one after another, after another, after another. And it certainly gives the sense that there is a design, that everything kind of leads to a certain conclusion. And that conclusion is you and me, that we are here because of the design of the universe. There's a lot of fine-tuning that had to take place in order for us to get here. Therefore, it's reasonable to believe that the universe was designed with purpose. in part, purposes human life, and that the designer is God. The third argument we made last week is the reality of right and wrong. Not everybody agrees on specifically what is right or what is wrong, but we all agree that there is such a thing as right and wrong, that there are objective moral values. Now, I suppose there are people out there and say, well, there aren't really any objective moral values. It's all just social construct, or it's just instinct. So let me rephrase the question a little bit than I did differently, a little bit differently than I did last week. Instead of saying that moral objective values and duties exist, let me say if. In other words, if you think that that is a true statement, if objective moral values and duties do exist, then you have to ask yourself a question. Well, where do those objective moral values come from? And one of the possibilities is that these objective moral values and duties come from a higher moral order. Now, once again, some people will debate that. But if the first thing is true, that there are objective moral values, and if those moral values come from a higher moral order, then it is reasonable to believe that a higher moral order exists. And if that higher moral order exists, it's also reasonable to assume that the source of that higher moral order is God. I touched on briefly the fourth argument, which has also been around for a long time. It's called the ontological argument, and it's just the basic definition of God. We'll talk about that in more detail in just a minute. The fifth argument, and now this gets into specifically a Christian argument for the existence of God, and that is the validity of the resurrection of Jesus. And we're going to talk about that at some length today. So notice that the first three arguments, you don't have to be a Christian to accept those arguments. In fact, even on that fourth argument, you don't have to be a Christian. Most religions will teach that there is a higher moral order, and that source of that higher moral order is God. Nothing real revolutionary about those four arguments. It's the fifth argument that starts to get down into, differences of opinion. But we're going to talk about that in some length. And then the final argument that I'll be bringing next week is the benefit of belief and the risk of unbelief. The benefit of belief and the risk of unbelief. In other words, if these first five arguments are valid, if it's reasonable to believe that these are true statements, that these conclusions are reasonable, then you're left with something that you've got to make a decision about. You either believe it and act upon it, or you reject it. And there are risks and benefits of either way, and we'll talk about those next week. But today I want to just mention again this basic definition of God, this ontological argument. The word ontological comes from the word ontos, and it means being, existing. God is defined as the greatest being conceivable. I think we would all pretty much agree with that. If you look it up in the dictionary, that's pretty much what it's going to say. A supreme being. No one greater than this being called God. And by greatest being, we ascribe certain characteristics to God. That God is omnipotent, that God is omniscient, and that God is morally perfect. Now notice that those are the three ideas that we got on the first three arguments for God. That God is the cause of the universe. That means that God is omnipotent, that God is all-powerful. That God is the designer of the universe. That means God is omniscient, God is all-knowing. And we believe that God is the source of moral order, that he is morally perfect. Now, if that's a reasonable definition of God, and I think we would all agree that's a reasonable definition, no one's going to really dispute that definition. Now, this next one is very interesting. A being that exists is greater than one who doesn't. Some people will say, well, that just sounds like you're just making it up, but I don't think I am. Because we're talking about a being. And we've already said that we're talking about one specific being, and that being is God. That God is the greatest being conceivable. And if a being that exists is greater than one who doesn't, guess what you're left with? It's reasonable to believe that God exists. This particular ontological argument, I think, is, believe it or not, in my opinion, more supported in the Scripture than any of the previous arguments. I mean, the Bible does say that God created the world. It does say that God has a purpose in creating the world, that God designed things the way a certain way, in that way that they are. And it certainly says that God is the source of moral order. But really, when you come right down to it, there is a matter of belief that undergirds all these ideas. And that belief is that God exists. That the God that we have already defined, who is omniscient, omnipotent, morally perfect, also exists. When Moses came across the burning bush up on Mount Sinai, God spoke to him out of the bush. Very unusual kind of situation. Doesn't happen every day. And Moses said, well, who are you? You know, this voice that's coming out of the bush, who are you? And God replied to Moses, I am who I am. That's an ontological argument. You get it? I am who I am. It could also be translated, I am what I am, or I am that I am. Or one of my favorite ways to translate this from Hebrew is, I am the one who is. God doesn't have to prove himself to anybody, but yet he does give us ample reasons to believe that he exists. The creation, the design, moral, our conscience, all these things are helpful to us in understanding the reality of God's existence. But when it comes right down to it, it takes an act of faith. We simply have to acknowledge the fact that God is. The Bible also says that only fools say in their hearts, there is no God. In other words, someone who doesn't have wisdom, someone who just is ignoring the reality around them, says there is no God. Now, the truth of the matter is there aren't that many people, really, who say there is no God. Almost everybody does think there is a God, except they just don't think it applies to them. You know, that belief hasn't worked into their life. It hasn't made any difference in their life that God exists. Now, there's a middle group there, so you got people who do believe in God and people who don't believe in God. And this middle group we would often call agnostics, people who say, well, I just don't know. Well, once again, they're not paying attention. I think God is probably that whole idea of just people want to sit on the fence forever isn't very pleasing to God. I think that certainly God wants people to believe. But, if you come to the conclusion that God just isn't there and you have really good reasons for it, okay, at least you went and investigated. Now, I truly think that anybody who does really investigate will come to the opposite conclusion, that they'll come to the conclusion that God does exist. But the people who sit on that fence and say, well, I just don't know, that's because they haven't really looked. There's another verse that I'm going to have up here, which I talked a little bit about last week, but I want to pay attention to this verse. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. So, a fool says in his heart, there is no God. What's the opposite of a fool? Someone who's wise. Someone who's gaining wisdom. What's the very first thing that the Bible says a person needs to have in order to begin a journey of wisdom? The very first thing is fear of the Lord. Now, some of your translations won't use the word fear because it's kind of a negative connotation. They might say respect. Oh, okay, that's true too. But I think fear is the right word. Now, let me just tell you who we're talking about here. We're talking about the God who made the world. We're talking about the God who designed the world. We're talking about the God who is morally perfect, who has told each of us in our conscience how we are to behave. And we also know, if we just examine ourselves a little bit, that we fail God, that we fail to live up to that moral standard, that we fail to acknowledge that he is the creator, that he has made us. But once we do come to that conclusion, that God did make us, and that he made us for a purpose, and that he has a moral code that we're supposed to live by, and we fail, it's only reasonable, it's only healthy for us to have fear of God in the beginning. It's the beginning of wisdom. But the knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. So there's something that goes beyond fear. I would not want any of the people in this room to stay in a sense of fear of God. It's important for us to start there, because that's an acknowledgement of who God really is. And it's also an acknowledgement that we have failed God. But how do we get to this next step? How do we get to this knowledge of the Holy One, which brings understanding? Some of you may have had catechism when you were young, and there's something called the Westminster Catechism. And it says, the chief aim of man is to glorify God and to enjoy him forever. Anybody here ever was taught that? There we go. Yeah, okay. The chief aim of man, and that's just because it's old language, let's call them humans, people. The chief aim, our purpose in life is to glorify God, the creator of heaven and earth, and to enjoy him forever. You cannot enjoy God forever if you are stuck in fear. You can't even enjoy God forever if you sort of say, I don't know about God, I'm just going to sit on the fence. You've got to get past those things into a point where you know God and begin to truly appreciate who God is. It says that we do that through knowledge of the Holy One. Anybody got to guess who the Holy One is? Jesus. Yeah. It's a reference to the Messiah. This is an Old Testament passage, so it doesn't know about Jesus specifically, who's not born for a while. But it certainly knows who Christ is, who knows who the Messiah is. So we have failed to live up to God's perfect standard, and therefore we rightly fear God. But this fear of God should prompt us to seek his mercy. Fortunately for us, he freely gives his mercy to anyone who asks. Once our fear of God is replaced or amended with his mercy and grace, we can know God through the Holy One, through his holy, one and only Son, Jesus Christ. Then we can begin to understand how to live lives that are pleasing to God. And that gets us back to this whole idea of the purpose of man. The chief aim of man is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. Now, we've now moved from an idea that is generally accepted out there in the religious world, that God is real, that God exists, that God created the world, designed the world as a source of moral order. That this definition of God I've got on the screen is legit. But we've moved from this sort of general sense of who God is to a very specific understanding of God, and that is the Christian understanding that Jesus Christ is the Holy One of God. And that is the way that we really begin to know God. Way more than we can know God simply by looking at creation. Way more than we can know God simply by having a sense of right and wrong in our conscience. We can begin to know God through his Son, Jesus Christ. So this brings us to the fifth logical reason to believe in God, the validity of the resurrection of Jesus. The life, death, and resurrection of Jesus are provable on historic grounds. Now, you're going to get some pushback, right? You say that's a true statement, and I believe it is a true statement. There'll be people that believe in the first four statements, first four arguments, but they may give you some pushback on this one here. They say, oh, you can't. Jesus is not historical. Well, he is. You could ask any college professor who teaches history, was Jesus a historical person? And they will say, well, of course. I'm not saying they're Christians. I'm just saying that they know history. Anybody who understands anything about history knows that there was a person named Jesus. Where it gets complicated in terms of history is that there's no natural explanation for the resurrection. Historically, people will say, yes, Jesus was a historical person. Yes, he was probably crucified by the Romans. And yes, something happened after that. But it takes an act of faith to believe that that something was the resurrection. You'll get secular historians who will believe in the first two, the life and death of Jesus, and when it comes to this resurrection, they'll say, well, he didn't really raise from the dead, because that's impossible, but his people believe that he rose from the dead. Well, I'm here to say that it's not just his people believe that he rose from the dead, it's that he did rise from the dead. And I'm going to try and show you historically why that's true. But there's no natural explanation for the resurrection. There are, I should point out, two natural explanations that were common at the time of Christ, and they're common in today's world. The first one is that Jesus didn't die. He didn't die on the cross. He looked like he died. It looked like he was buried in a tomb, but he didn't. He recovered from that. That, by the way, what I just described, is the common Muslim understanding of the resurrection. So, in other words, it's not a resurrection. It just appeared to be a resurrection. It just looked like it. His believers just thought he had come back from the dead. I read a statement. Someone said, there's no record of a Roman crucifixion that didn't kill the one being crucified. If you understand what a crucifixion is, it's a pretty gruesome way to die. And it's 100% effective. And it is almost laughable that someone would believe that someone who was crucified by the Romans, sentenced to death, that the Romans were absolutely certain that he had died, and then he's buried, and somehow, because he's buried in this nice cool tomb and has a day or two to recover, that he's able to roll the stone out from the inside out and come out, and everybody thinks, oh, look, Jesus is back. The second explanation, natural explanation for the resurrection is that it really wasn't a resurrection, it's just the empty tomb. That there was, in fact, an empty tomb, and the reason it's empty is because the disciples of Jesus stole the body. That's actually recorded in the Bible, but it's also recorded in Jewish writings. That's the standard explanation for the resurrection in Jewish circles. So the two great sort of competing religions to Christianity have to deal with this idea of resurrection. Interestingly enough, neither one of them say that there was no person named Jesus. They never go back there and say it's just a figment of our imagination or some fable or some myth. They all acknowledge that Jesus was a real person. They all acknowledge that he died. It's just over this issue of the resurrection that they have a challenge. But I'm saying there is no natural explanation. Therefore, it's reasonable to believe that Jesus was raised from the dead supernaturally by God. What do the historians agree on about Jesus? They agree that he was a Galilean Jew who lived somewhere between 1 BC and 33 BC. That's the traditional dates. Some others will have a little bit earlier date. It has really to do not with Jesus so much as to do with the lifetime and death of Herod the Great. And they'll say it's between 4 BC and maybe 30 AD. But it's in there. Jesus spoke Aramaic, which is kind of close to Hebrew. And he may also have spoken Hebrew and Greek. He was baptized by John the Baptist. John the Baptist is recorded in secular history a surprising amount. And he's in a sense almost more famous than Jesus in the early time. He's mentioned in the Jewish writings. He's mentioned in the Roman writings. And all modern historians, even those who are not believers, will accept the truth, the historical truth, that Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist. And that happened around 30 A.D. After his baptism, Jesus began an itinerant teaching ministry. In other words, traveling around. And he traveled with a group of chosen disciples. Now, we eventually call those disciples the apostles. That Jesus was known for performing miracles. He's a miracle worker. Now, you go to the outside sources, and they acknowledge that he performed miracles, but they don't think he performed miracles by the power of God. They think that he performed miracles through some kind of sorcery or some other kind of, magic. But they don't deny that he performed miracles. Isn't that amazing? I'm not talking about what Christians believe. I'm talking about what non-Christians believe. And then, ultimately, this led to a conflict, a major controversy that took place in the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, and where Jesus disrupted the money changers. Shortly after that, he was arrested, and now you know sort of the rest of the story. But those first items about the life of Jesus, those are historical facts. And no one's going to dispute them other than someone who doesn't understand history. But what about the death of Jesus? Well, after he was arrested for disrupting the money changers in the temple, he was found guilty of blasphemy. He claimed to be the Messiah or the Son of God. Once again, this is well documented in the Jewish writings. They considered Jesus to be a false prophet because he claimed to be God. And he was accused of blasphemy by the Sanhedrin, the Jewish council, and he was crucified by the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate. Now, Pontius Pilate is another interesting character. He's mentioned in lots of different documents, including the New Testament, but also outside documents. And not that long ago, they found a monument with his name on it in Caesarea, in Israel. We've seen it. It's got his name on it. He really is somebody real. He's so real that his name's written in stone. He was the governor of Galilee, not Galilee, but of Judea during the time of Jesus. The other thing that is historically supported is that Jesus, after he was crucified, was buried in a known location. The idea of being in a known location is very important. Because, now the Bible tells us that he was born in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. It was a brand new tomb. There was nobody else in that tomb at the time. Buried. What did I say? What did I just say? Born. He wasn't born in a tomb. No, he was buried. He was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, who was a member of the Sanhedrin. But that's just in the Bible. If you get outside the Bible, he's buried in a known location. And how do we know it's a known location? Because everybody acknowledges that the tomb was empty. How did they know the tomb was empty if they didn't know what tomb he was buried in? You following this? So they know that the tomb is empty, and they come up with these excuses of why the tomb is empty. The disciples stole the body, or he recovered somehow and escaped. Nobody said, he's still in the tomb. Nobody said, hey, let's just go over to the tomb and we'll just show you. There's a dead body in the tomb. Nobody said that. All right. So that leaves us now with the resurrection. We've got the life, death, and now the resurrection. So something happened shortly after the death of Jesus. We know that a major impact event happened because of the effect it had on his followers and on his enemies. Something happened. Now, we're going to find out that something is the resurrection. But you don't have to necessarily know that at this point. All you got to know is that something happened. Peter, shortly after the death of Jesus, said something happened. He was talking to a crowd, and he said, this is what happened. God raised Jesus from the dead. And we are all, in other words, his group of disciples, we are all witnesses of this. There was a period of 40 days from the time of the resurrection to the time that Jesus ascended into heaven, where Jesus met with these disciples, with the apostles. He met with his family. He met with 500 at one time. He met with a lot of different people. And they had a hard time accepting that he was risen from the dead. Jesus said, well, touch me. Look, I've got holes in my hand. I got a wound in my side where they put a spear. And he would be glorified. He could appear out of thin air. So this is what they said. This is what they said was the big impact event. God had raised Jesus from the dead. Now we can know that something important happened by looking, you can look at the response of the enemies, but let's just look at the response of the apostles. What was the impact of the resurrection on the apostles? And that's in your outline. Well, before the resurrection, these were all Jewish people, Jewish followers of the Jewish religion. And they would go to the temple and they would make animal sacrifices. So that's the first thing, animal sacrifices. Second, they all believed in the binding law of Moses. Third, they were strict monotheists. Fourth, they were highly devoted to the idea of the Sabbath. They believed that the Messiah was going to come and set them free from Rome. They believed in a conquering Messiah. They also believed that the initiation ceremony to become Jewish, a man, was through circumcision. And immediately after the crucifixion, they were timid and afraid. They were hiding from the authorities because they were afraid they might be next. Then you have this impact event, this thing that Peter says was that God raised Jesus from the dead. And so now we have this whole other kind of, the same guys, just a month later, completely changed their view on what they believe. They believe not in the animal sacrifice, but in Christ's sacrifice. That's a huge, huge shift. Because they thought that when they sinned, they could take a sacrifice to the temple and offer that sacrifice for the remission of their sin. And now they believe that Jesus died for their sins. Big difference there. Instead of the binding law of Moses, they believed in justification by faith. That's a big word, but it means that they realized that they could simply believe that Jesus died for their sins, and that meant that their sins would be forgiven. Instead of being strict monotheists, they believed Jesus was the Son of God. Instead of celebrating religious observances on the Sabbath, they now met on the Lord's Day. The Sabbath is a Saturday, the Lord's Day is Sunday. Instead of a conquering Messiah, they believed in a sacrificial Messiah. They had taken, there was a whole bunch of, and there still are, a whole bunch of verses in the Old Testament that seem to indicate that the Messiah would be this conquering hero. And that's what the people focused on. But there's this whole other set of passages in the Old Testament that say that the Messiah was going to suffer, that he was going to be the sacrifice for the sins of the world. And they began to see those passages that had been in the Bible all along, but now they saw them as something really significant. That doesn't mean that the conquering Messiah passages don't apply. They're just not, they just don't apply yet. That's all coming. It's the sacrificial aspect of the Messiah that they began to really focus on. And instead of circumcision, the initiation ceremonies and the important rituals of the Christian church is baptism and communion. We're going to be celebrating communion here in a few minutes. And instead of being timid and afraid, they were brave and bold. And they were willing to die because they believed in the resurrection. Now, that resurrection could have been some kind of mass hallucination, or maybe they did steal the body, or maybe Jesus did somehow recover from the resurrection and walk around for a while. But none of those explain the change in what happened to the apostles. And you don't have to believe the New Testament. You just know that that's what happened. I'm going to give you some quick dates and then we'll go to communion. But if you believe the crucifixion took place in 33 AD, you could say it happened in 30. That's okay. It's usually one or the other. In 33 AD, thousands of Jews in Jerusalem believed the disciples' message at Pentecost. Pentecost is 50 days after the death of Christ. It's after the Passover. So keep this in mind. Starting off at 33, something happened, and we call that Pentecost. And the belief that Jesus had risen from the dead spread rapidly throughout Jerusalem and Judea and into surrounding nearby Jewish communities. A year later, in 33 AD, a Greek believer, not a Jewish believer, but a Greek believer named Stephen was stoned for saying that Jesus had risen from the dead. He was a deacon of the church in Jerusalem, and his death was encouraged by Saul of Tarsus. Saul of Tarsus was a Pharisee who thought that Jesus was preaching blasphemy. As the persecution widened, Saul sought and received authorization from the Sanhedrin to arrest Jewish Christians in Damascus, Syria. It wasn't just in their own country. They was going to now go to another country and start to arrest these people for being believers in the resurrection. Or some impact event, if you prefer. On the way to Damascus, this Pharisee who wanted to destroy the early church, he underwent a dramatic conversion. And he became a believer. He claimed to have seen the risen Lord. Not only risen, but glorified. Light, blinding light. He then, after that event, came back to Jerusalem, met with the apostles for a short while. God has told them that he had seen Christ. They explained to him what had all happened, and they were amazed that this man who was trying to destroy the church was now a member of the church. And what's really interesting about Paul is pretty much for the next 14 years after this, he spent, to a large degree, by himself, coming to grips with what had happened. Coming to grips with what had happened to him on this road to Damascus. It was such a, let's admit it, crazy thing that had happened. He had to say, did that really happen to me? How could it possibly be? And he got some insight from Peter and James and the other apostles that he could go to the Old Testament, and in his study of the Old Testament, he could find out the truth about the Messiah. This idea of that the Messiah was not just the conquering Messiah, but the sacrificial Messiah. That we could be justified before God by having faith in the Messiah. In 44 AD, while Paul is still trying to figure it all out, an even more serious persecution broke out in Jerusalem, which included James the Just. Anybody know who James the Just is? James the Just is the brother of Jesus. James the Just did not believe in Jesus during Jesus' lifetime. I mean, he believed in Jesus. He doesn't believe that Jesus was the Messiah. After the resurrection, it very specifically says that Jesus appeared to his family, to his brothers and sisters, including James. And James then became what is essentially the leader of the church in Jerusalem. And he became very powerful. In other words, he's very influential because it was essentially, if you think about what Christianity was doing at this time, it's actually an offshoot or a branch of Judaism. And now you've got these sort of competing faith ideas of the Old Testament Jewish idea and sort of what the New Testament Jewish idea would be, led by James the Just. And we know that he was executed by Herod Agrippa. How do we know that? Because it's in the history books. Not in the Bible, per se, but in the Roman and Jewish secular record. And that happened in 44. A year later, the conflict between the traditional Jews and the Christian Jews eventually reached Rome. And that led to an expulsion of all the Jews from the city by the Emperor Claudius. Once again, documented in the Roman records, not in the Bible, but in the Roman records. In 50 AD, the Apostle Paul began his first of 3 missionary journeys. Remember, he got impacted by the risen Lord in 35 AD, spent the next 14 years, 15 years or so, trying to figure it all out. Finally understood it enough to say, I got it. I got it. Not only does he get it, he gets it so much he wants to tell everybody. And by then, because of these various persecutions, both Jewish and Christian, that the Jewish people had been scattered throughout much of the Roman world. And Paul wants to go visit them and tell them the truth about Jesus. This is 15 years after his conversion. And when he would go into these towns, he would start off by going into the synagogue and preaching to Jews about the resurrection. And eventually he'd get usually some converts there, and then he would go and spread the word in the marketplace to the Gentiles. The belief in Jesus as the promised Messiah spread among Jews and Gentiles throughout the Roman Empire, in large part because of his efforts. There are lots of examples of places throughout the Middle East and Turkey and Greece that will mention the fact that Paul was there. By 64 AD, remember we started off here at 33, by 64 AD, a widespread persecution of Christians erupted in Rome. You know who the emperor was? Nero. Now that really happened. Okay, I mean, it's not in the Bible at all. Okay, I mean, that really happened. That's in the Roman records. Something had changed these Jewish people in Jerusalem from people who were Jewish to people who believed that Jesus was the Messiah, that Jesus had died for their sins, that Jesus was God. During that persecution in Rome, included the martyrdom of 2 famous apostles. Anybody know who they were? Peter and Paul. 2 years later, in 66 AD, the great Jewish revolt against Rome began in Judea, eventually resulting in the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 70 AD. That's not a very long period of time, 33 to 70. And a whole lot happened. And a whole lot happened because something sparked it. There was a catalyst that took it and moved it all forward. And that catalyst was that a group of people believed that Jesus had risen from the dead. They believed it so much that they spread that message throughout the Roman Empire. They believed it so much that they came against all kinds of opposition. First from the Jewish leaders and then also from the Roman leaders. It was just so disruptive. Now we can say, well, should Christianity be disruptive? Well, this kind, yeah. If it turns out that Jesus is the Son of God, that should be disruptive. And it was disruptive. Does anybody have any questions about this on the board? My point is, you don't have to read the Gospels even to know this. You can read a history book and know this. All right. You can also have a couple other books that I recommend. More Than a Carpenter by Josh McDowell, classic, been out for 50 years. Same idea here as The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel. I used to work for a marketing company, Christian marketing company, and we got to know Lee and promoted this book. It's a really good book. And then one that you've never heard of, I'm guessing, is that incredible book, the Bible. And what I like about this book is that it impacted me personally. before I became a Christian, I mean, I was raised in a Catholic home. Yeah, I'm going to say it out loud. I was raised in a Catholic home, but went to Catholic school. Somehow or another, I missed it. Not everybody that goes to Catholic church and Catholic school misses it, but I missed it. I didn't get it. And I left it all behind. But it started to really nag at me as I got to be in my mid-20s. And I was at a bookstore. I was actually at a used book and record store looking for music. And I came across this section in the middle aisle, and there's a bunch of used books. And I don't know why. I mean, I do probably believe it's God, okay? But this book caught my attention. The incredible book, the Bible. And I picked it up, and I started thumbing through it. And for the very first time in my life, hard to believe, but for the very first time in my life, I started to understand that the events that were recorded in the Bible many of them are historically valid. That are not just valid, but provable. That there really was a Jerusalem. I mean, I can't believe I didn't know that. I mean, I'm talking about back then, okay? Or that there really is a Sea of Galilee. I mean, I know that it just seems crazy to me that I didn't even understand basic stuff. All I had to do is get out a map, and I could have figured out some stuff. But I thought it was all just fantasy. But it's not fantasy. And that's what that book goes through and talks about.